We're going to have a brief discussion on French antique clocks. French clockmaking came into its own in the 17th century when highly ornamented clocks covered in gilt bronze known as ormolu were produced to keep pace with the new standards for opulence set by the King Louis, the 14th century Palace of Versailles. There were two general styles of antique French clocks during this period. One was known as boule, which refers to a clock cased in tortoiseshell or inlaid with brass, pewter, porcelain, and/or ivory. The second type was called réglagés, in which brass and pewter overlays were set in ebony veneers on oak. During the Regency period, from roughly 1750 to 1723, bracket clocks, which had been popular a century before, came back into prominence. A bracket clock could be hung on a wall or placed on a table, making it a flexible timepiece compared to, say, the long case clocks, which were also being produced at that time. Rococo pendule for pendulum clocks featured curvaceous profiles and seemingly endless decorative detailing. By the time Louis XVI assumed the throne, he reigned from 1774 to 1791 and was executed in 1793. Clockmakers were producing highly accurate regulators, protected from dust by glass domes and mantle clocks festooned with everything from bronze, Greek, and Roman statuary to cherubs. This was also the era of cartel clocks, housed in elaborate bronze cast or gold leaf on wood frames. Cartel is French for the word frame. The clock dial was framed by a very ornately carved surround. These French wall clocks often featured Roman numerals on white dials, surrounded by gilt garlands and figurines. One of the many makers of these sorts of clocks, as well as other styles, was Frederick Japy, whose Japy frères, which means brothers, would become the leading French clockmakers in the 19th century. From the 18th century onward, long case clocks were made in Normandy, at Saint-Nicolas-d'Orlemont, near Dieppe. This was a localized industry, and these clocks rarely made it outside of Normandy. Tall, thin, key-wound, Normandy clocks had short pendulums, were rope-driven, and featured enameled faces and ornately carved hoods or bonnets. French antique 17th century clocks origins. French clockmaking essentially began in the 17th century, around 1670. Isaac II Thuré, French clockmaker to King Louis XIV, made a clock featuring a pendulum and dial that indicated hours, minutes, and seconds. Because the reign of Louis XIV during this time can be characterized, at least for the French royals, as a time of excess, the sentiment was reflected in French clockmaking. French cabinet maker André Charles Boule was perhaps primarily responsible for the period clocks having cabinet enclosures with intricate and gilded surrounds and designs. Generally, French clocks of the 17th century can be categorized boldly into two categories: boule clocks and réglagé clocks, regulator clocks. French boule clocks. As the name suggests, boule clocks originated with André Charles Boule. He was the cabinet maker to the king. The prominent features of these types of clocks include tortoiseshell cabinet cases with decorations alongside or included in the clock itself, gilt bronze, and inlays made of a combination of brass, pewter, porcelain, and/or ivory. French réglagé clocks. These were typically having brass and pewter overlays set in a rectangular ebony veneered or oak cases. Like boule clocks, the tops were dome-shaped a design element inspired by English timepieces. Perhaps because Buhl also made these type of clocks, they could also have tortoiseshell cases and gilt bronzes. Though this category can generally be considered comparatively less ornate than typical Buhl clocks. History of antique French clocks. Regency period. Some clocks from this period, 1750 through 1723, were balloon-shaped and were carved of wood, marquetry, and or bronze. Clocks were often produced to be hung on the wall. Though long-case clocks, for example, standing clocks, were so much in demand, long-case clocks from this period are quite difficult to find today. They are easy to distinguish from their English counterparts, though, having a rounded top and offered a silvered dial. They have complex movements with dates and moon phases frequently added. The more elaborate clocks were still mainly found in the homes of the very affluent and wealthy. Louis XVI period, 1750 to 1790. This was the great period in French clock production. Clocks had become more accurate, and it was common to have glass doors in the front of the clock and a bronze headpiece on top, typically figural. Clocks were ornate and gilded. From 1750 onward, cartel clocks were produced. These had a cast brass and gilded case, an enamel dial, and spring-driven movements. Decorations on the case were delicate and ornate and included scrolls, flowers, and figurines. The Empire period, 1799 through 1815. This was a period where ormolu and ornamentation remained popular in French clocks. Classic Greek and Roman figures were incorporated into the casings of table clocks. In the 1800s, the Gothic style began to be incorporated into French design, and clocks were made to look like Gothic cathedrals in miniature, and producing their moldings, and they became extraordinarily ornate. These so-called skeleton clocks became popular, in which the workings of the clock were visible through the case. The mechanism was protected by a glass covering, and these were typically hand-blown. Let's go to the 20th century. French clockmaking was influenced by the arts and crafts movement, Art Deco, and Art Nouveau. Some of the aesthetic of the Art Deco movement called for stronger and bolder lines and designs. Many clocks were made with glass, marble, and onyx. Clock decorations included figurines from mythology, humans, and animals.